Well, I'd like to welcome all of you who are in the room, and then all of you who are in ships at sea and on online in various places around the world for joining us here for what we think is going to be a super program. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor J.P. Alfred for really getting this to happen. He holds multiple hats at both the business and in the engineering schools at George Mason, and with his organization, which is called CARE, which you can read all about on the website. CARE is a fantastic group of people who are really cutting-edge technologists going back over a period of 30 years. It's really, I'm very fortunate to sort of have an associate membership in it. And so we are really pleased to be doing this here today. My organization is the Financial Technology and Cybersecurity Center. And we are generally more focused on cybersecurity and on financial services. But last August, I started noticing these age verification laws and parental consent laws, and said, "Wow, this is a really interesting. What's new? I mean, what's old is new again, because all this started back in the late 1990s, and we had decisions in Georgia and in New York in federal district courts basically telling the states to stay out of the internet. And now the states are back and they weren't interested in staying out. And so we have some fascinating issues. And let me just sort of take you through for everybody what these panels are gonna cover. Our first panel is on the laws that have been passed in Texas and in Florida, which generally speaking are intended to encourage neutrality in the availability of different types of content on large platforms. I'm sure there are many people who could take issue with everything I just said, but that's, I think, writ large, an accurate statement. And those cases just went before the Supreme Court in February. We are incredibly fortunate to have Stephanie Joyce of the CCIA, which was one of the two parties. The other party was Net Choice, and Carl Sabo will be with us here in panel 2. So to have the two people who are acting on behalf of the key private parties here in the case is just, I think, a terrific opportunity for us to hear from people who are really well-versed in this area. And we have also John Morris, who is one of the fathers of the Internet from being with the Internet Society and so forth, and others as well. So it's going to be, the question there really is questions about are these large platforms essentially the press, and do they have First Amendment protections? And then the state attorney generals, and we will have, on behalf of Missouri, the Solicitor General, states have taken positions about how there's a freedom to hear things and learn things, and that this is being restricted by this, and others who are saying police power cannot be overtaken simply by these First Amendment considerations. So panel 1 is a live Supreme Court issue that, if any of you listened to the Supreme Court arguments, there's a lot of discussion about how to look at this and what the prior precedent did. So really looking forward to that one. The second panel is essentially sort of a cousin. Second panel is about age verification laws for adult content sites, and for as well as for parental consent for access to social media sites, which has become a very hot issue. And we are incredibly fortunate that Senator McKell of Utah has journeyed 2/3 of the way across the country to come and be with us in person to talk about the pioneering legislation that he sponsored in Utah on parental consent, which is under attack by Carl Sabo of NetChoice, who will also be on the panel. And that spins out a whole range of issues. An additional issue is also design requirements. California has imposed design requirements intended to protect children. Those were struck down by district court, and that's now going to the Ninth Circuit. And Carl is also, I believe, involved in that case as well. And finally, just to further whet your appetite, the Texas age verification law went before the Fifth Circuit and was lost 2-1. That is Tom Vartanian, my senior colleague at the Financial Technology and Cybersecurity Center, just joining us here, looking very dapper as always. So on that one, the Fifth Circuit ruled 2-1 that the Texas law was valid. It went on the shadow docket to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did not interfere with that. So now it will eventually, I guess, get back to the Supreme Court in due course, but that law is now in effect in Texas. And our final panel deals with the California law that was just passed the end of last year called the Delete Act, which if you're a California resident, in 2006, you will be able to push a button on some website, and that will direct all the registered data brokers in California, which probably should be pretty much all the data brokers in the country, to have to scrub all your information out of their systems. This is probably a technological nightmare for those of you who are tech people. I'm seeing people smiling and they're shaking their head and so forth. But what that really opens up is this whole world of data brokerage. We're going to have a representative of the advertising industry, as well as 3 other distinguished panelists to talk about data brokerage. I think, a lot of times general people kind of like it because it serves up stuff that they're interested in, and some people don't like having their life being completely tracked. So it just depends on how you feel about the whole thing. So that's a short summary of where we're going to be. JP, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you all for joining, and thanks to those who joined online, and to all of our wonderful speakers. I'd like to especially thank Bob, who had the idea for the program and invited the speakers and established the concepts for the panel, and thank Tom, who was always wonderful to work with. So with that, turn it over to Bob here to turn it over to Tom to actually start.
Great, thank you. Thanks, JP. I appreciate it, and always a pleasure to work with you and George Mason, and particularly on this kind of a program. I spent the last few years writing my latest book, which is The Unhackable Internet. And it really sort of comes home in this program here today, because as I was basically representing people over the last 40 years and helping them incorporate and deal with technology, I realized that much of what we were doing had 2 very real aspects to them. One was the lack of borders. And 2 was the lack of security. And so I started writing about that after I left private practice, and I could actually say what I wanted to say freely. But the problem we have here now is we've got every country in the world and every state in every country in the world wanting to regulate the internet. And of course, you have to scratch your head about that a little bit, because cyberspace has no borders. And so once everybody starts regulating, you either end up with a situation, which I think we have now both lived through both, either nobody's regulating or everybody's regulating. And neither of those solutions works, right? Neither of those solutions work. And I'll put aside the security question, because I think, we're now dealing with an internet that is horribly insecure, incredibly vulnerable. And I've said this very often as I've been speaking, particularly about the book, and that is, if we wanted to create a cyberspace that made us incredibly vulnerable and subject to threat, we would have created the cyberspace we have, right? So today we're going to focus on one aspect of this, and that is the race to regulate the internet. Now that everybody's figured out that all this content is out there, you know, you've got these two different forces coming together. Those who say we should allow content to be out there, and those who say, well, wait a minute, we've got to protect some people from that content, or we've got to restrict that content, or we've got to restrict the collection of data, which of course is another whole issue. And, you know, when I started doing this back in the 90s, when the internet really started to take off, we all knew that this was going to pit security versus privacy, right? It's the security versus privacy issue over and over and over again. How much security do you want? How much privacy do you want? How much do you balance those two things? And so our first panel today is going to look at some of the questions that are being determined. And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court has been cooperating terrifically by taking on some of these cases and hearing some of them. And we are very fortunate today to have three really terrific panels. Our first panel has got Stephanie Joyce, who's with the Computer and Communications Industry Association. And I'm not, all of their wonderful credentials, and they're all experts, and they're all terribly involved in everything, is all online in their bios. I won't go through that because we'll be spending the entire day reading bios. But I hope you'll look at those and see the credentials of the people that we've got here. And then we've got also on this panel three lawyers who are intimately involved in these lawsuits, Michael Che, Josh Devine, and John Morris. So with that, I'm going to ask each of them to make a short 3 to 4 minute statement to sort of put their stake in the ground for their position and what their concerns are or arguments are. And then we will go from there, and JP and I will moderate this panel and hopefully try to bring it to some culmination point at the end of the hour and a half. So, Stephanie, why don't you start with your short statement?
Thanks so much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very proud to be the Chief of Staff and Senior Vice President of CCIA, and very proud to be associated with the Paxton and Moody cases. Of course, we're all lawyers. Have to drop the disclaimer here that what I'm about to say reflects the thoughts, wishes, hopes, and dreams of Stephanie Joyce and not of my organization. To begin, and I'm sorry to do this, Bob, because we became such fast friends, Bob characterized the Texas and Florida statutes that are under challenge and presently enjoined as an effort to ensure the neutrality of the internet. I believe that these statutes would ensure the unusability of the internet. They are must-carry legislation for the internet. They are unprecedented. And at the risk of sounding overly dramatic, and it is May Day, and I'm not sure the significance of that scheduling, these cases are nothing less than CCIA's and NetChoice's joint effort to ensure that the First Amendment is alive and well and fully applicable to online speech. The First Amendment truly is at stake in these cases. The central question of both, and this was the choice of the Attorneys General of Texas and Florida, the question is simply, is what applications and websites do in their various sites, communities, is that expression? CCIA and NetChoice have demonstrated over and over in these two cases that it is expression. It is editorial discretion. It is curation. It is review. It is a choice of what to display and how to display it. The argument on February 26th somewhat went afield of that question. We had a longer procedural tussle than I think anybody envisioned. And there were some familiar refrains, such as, these entities are very large, So why can't we restrict their speech? Because they're big. Of course, the answer to that is antitrust lives over here. The First Amendment lives in the Constitution, and it's the First Amendment for a reason. And you can't use the First Amendment as a replacement for economic regulation, even assuming that large means anything in this beautiful thing that the world has wrought, which is the internet. The question whether content moderation is expression, and for the uninitiated, to the extent anyone here is uninitiated, content moderation is that reification of the choices, the curation, and the relative organization of various content. Decades of precedent, and certainly we can borrow from the newspaper realm, but also in Hurley, the parade milieu, that choice absolutely is protected expression. What these statutes would do is, on pain of crushing regulatory obligations, prevent websites and applications from performing content moderation. They might think, and I don't know because I was not in those legislative hearings or the rooms where it happened, they might think that these statutes are ensuring even-handedness, I don't know. But what it ensures is that all of these operators of all of these websites and applications cannot curate content, cannot serve their communities, cannot even abide by their own terms of service that are posted on their websites and in their introductions to their applications, because Texas and Florida know best. And Texas and Florida a priori know all of the content that third parties are going to post on these websites and in these applications. And all of it deserves to be seen. Our brief and several amici, including Mr. Che, my buddy here on the screen, they filed amicus briefs that demonstrated, no, we really don't want all of that content. We want users to have a good experience. We don't want them wading through hundreds of thousands of posts that have nothing to do with what their interest is. So we await the Supreme Court's decisions, and I'm very pleased to participate on this panel and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Josh, 2-3 minutes.
Thanks for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here. If here means remote, it's still wonderful to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the doctrine. As you mentioned initially, Missouri, on behalf of 20 other states or 19 other states, submitted an amicus brief in both the net choice cases. And we argued that, contrary to what Stephanie just said, these in fact are constitutional. The Texas laws and the Florida laws are constitutional under the First Amendment. And to explain why, I want to paint two pictures for you real quick. Think back to April 2020, just about 4 years ago. And let's say you're on the phone with your mother, your brother, your grandfather, and you say, I think this COVID thing maybe leaked from a lab in China. And now suddenly you're no longer on the phone with your mother, your brother, or your grandfather. Instead, you are on the phone with a Verizon wireless representative who tells you you have violated their terms of service and you are now going to be suspended from your cell phone and the cell phone network for 15 days. Naturally, you're upset, so you contact your local legislator and they say, sorry, there's really nothing we can do about that. If you don't like that, then you are free to build your own nationwide cell network. Now consider the second scenario. You're at home, maybe you're a student and you're working diligently studying for finals. Maybe you've got a project, a deadline rapidly approaching, and suddenly your internet and your electricity cuts out, and your electric company gives you a call and they say, we saw this social media post that you posted a couple days ago saying that you prefer gas vehicles to electric vehicles. And we're a socially conscious company. We believe climate change is a real threat to the future of this world. And we're not going to let you use our electricity to undermine our message. So we're cutting you off from your electricity. Now, I recognize I'm speaking largely to a tech crowd, which leans a little bit more laissez-faire in a lot of different instances. But I think most people, 99% of people, would say that these two circumstances are intolerable. There's something wrong with what's going on here. And so the question we try to answer in our amicus brief is, does it make a difference when it's Facebook or Google doing this than when it's the electric company or Verizon Wireless? And we argue there isn't any difference. Now, I mentioned Verizon Wireless. You ever wonder why we don't actually hear about this problem on Verizon Wireless? Why isn't Verizon doing the same thing that Facebook and Google are doing? Well, it's because they used to, or at least telegraph and telephone companies back in the day used to do that. And it became a problem, and the states and the federal government legislated and did the same thing that Texas and Florida have done here. We've had laws on the books going back all the way to the 1800s prohibiting this same exact kind of conduct. The medium is a little different. The technology is obviously different, but there's close to 150 years of precedent of regulating the way that Texas and Florida are regulating here. The Fifth Circuit, in upholding the Texas regulation, found this history very weighty. Now, there is another side to the argument, and that's what NetChoice relies on tremendously. And basically, the Supreme Court has said, well, you can't do this sort of thing for newspapers or parades or things of that nature. And so what you have here doctrinally is you have a continuum. You have, on the one hand, the Supreme Court said, yes, you can have these must-carry regulations. You can have them for telephones. You can have them for telegraphs. No, you cannot have them for newspapers. You can't have them for parades. And so the question from a doctrinal matter really just becomes, what is Facebook and what is Google more like? Are they more like a telephone, like a telegraph, or are they more like a newspaper and a parade? And typically, the courts have focused on a couple things in this kind of analysis. They have focused on whether the must-carry regulation would interfere with the company's own ability to get out its message. And in the newspaper context, for example, what you see is an analysis based on, well, there are space constraints in the newspaper. When somebody reads a newspaper, they reasonably expect and they reasonably anticipate that everything that's in that newspaper is something that the newspaper company picked out and controlled. And this is really the newspaper speech. And when you take away space for them to speak, then you are interfering with their ability to get out their own message. That obviously doesn't apply in the telephone context. The telephone is responsible for transporting my speech from point A to point B. Nobody thinks that speech on Verizon's network is Verizon's speech rather than my speech. And when you run this analysis, well, it looks like Facebook and Google look a whole lot more like a telephone provider than they do a newspaper. Nobody thinks that speech on Facebook is Facebook speech. And in fact, in every Section 230 case, Facebook is very quick to point out and very quick to strenuously argue that the speech is not theirs, it's somebody else's. There's also no space constraints. I mean, there really is no actual infinity in the physical universe that we've been able to identify, but the internet comes pretty close. It's nothing like a newspaper. The amount of content that is uploaded every single minute is just astronomical. And so if you're looking at this continuum, is Facebook, is Google, are they more like a telephone or are they more like a newspaper? I think the answer is pretty clear that they're more like the former than the latter. And that's why we argued that these are constitutional under the First Amendment.
Thank you. Let's go on to Michael.
Thank you for having me on this panel. I'm so glad to participate, even if it's remotely. I want to drill down a little further on Stephanie's comments about what the core speech activity is, and then respond a little bit to Josh's comments on some of the common carriers that he mentioned. But I think the critical issue in this case is not so much whether websites are more like newspapers or parades or any of those things. The court does not need to have one-to-one analogies to anything. Really, the question is, do they practice a protected free speech activity in the first place? And what is that activity? Stephanie talked about content moderation. I'm going to just rephrase I don't like the word content moderation. It sounds very technical, sounds very jargony, but it's basically making decisions about other people's content, right? Whether or not posts should be left up or not. And the reason why that is a protected speech activity is because it reflects judgments, value judgments about what speech is worth saying, what speech should be said, what speech should be left unsaid. And everyone who operates a private forum for speech, an explicit forum where people are invited to speak, whether it's a bulletin board at your local Publix, or whether it's a parade, or whether it's your own personal Facebook page, you are providing a space for people to speak. And by removing content or telling people what they should or shouldn't put on that bulletin board or open mic night or whatever, you are exercising your expression as to what speech you think should be put there. That's a very extraordinarily important concept in the First Amendment. It's been the law for 50 years since the Tornillo case. And just this term, the Supreme Court gave a nod to this right. And this is the case Linkey versus Freed. And Justice Barrett, writing for a unanimous court, and this is a dispute over city manager's decision to block someone from his personal Facebook page, says, if Freed acted in his private capacity when he blocked Linkey and deleted his comments, he did not violate Linkey's First Amendment rights. Instead, he exercised his own. That's a very significant and telling statement by the court, which I think will presage what the decision will ultimately be here. If the act of deleting someone else's comment from your own Facebook page is protected speech, then it has to be true not only for Mr. Freed, but it also has to be true for Facebook and others. And the case here is not that hard. It doesn't, your First Amendment rights don't disappear merely because you have, 10 users, 100 million users, 100,000 users. That's not how the First Amendment works. We don't distinguish between different parties' rights based on how many people they serve or what kind of entities they are. As to the comments about your water company going to cut off your water, or your electric company, I mean, those parties are not engaged in speech. They're not making speech decisions. They are providing a service. It is conduct. If they shut off your water or electricity, that would be conduct, not speech, even if it's motivated by some kind of bizarre speech issue. The issue in these cases are, can forums that are expressly dedicated to providing speech forums and are expressly telling people what they should and should not upload to those forums, can they exercise their rights just like every other owner of a private forum that provides an opportunity for people to speak? And so that's how I see the cases, and I see the Supreme Court's most likely going to uphold that right for private owners of property to control what is said and left unsaid on their forums. Thank you.
Thank you. So, John, you're the cleanup hitter right now.
Great, thanks. Well, John Morris. I've been a First Amendment attorney since the early '90s, focused on the internet. But I'm actually today not going to spend that much time as my fellow lawyers are talking about the First Amendment. But I actually want to talk a little bit about kind of the practical implications of what the states of Florida and Texas and what Josh is supporting from Missouri kind of work out to. So a couple of quick thought experiments, and to ask you to think about, what would the internet be like without content moderation or content restrictions? And so just look at email. Would you prefer to have your current email service that has some spam blocking capability, even if it's not perfect? Or would you prefer to have, would it be better if all of those spam blocking services were prohibited? Your email service wouldn't be permitted to block content. And I think the answer, of course, is you would prefer to have spam filtering. Well, email is not at issue in the cases we're talking about here, but that really is, frankly, what we're talking about. A world without content moderation would create a world where going online to an online forum to talk about a particular topic, you would be deluged with off-topic comments, nasty vitriolic comments, repetitive comments by a poster who is still repeatedly every day is saying the same thing to try to make his or her point. And my question to you is, would that be a more constructive place to have a dialogue? Or quite possibly, would you say, this is really not worth my time. This is not worth the kind of hassle of wading through all of this stuff. And I would quibble a little bit. I have lots of quibbles with Josh, but I'm going to first quibble with Michael. And Michael phrased it as saying these platforms are saying, what speech is worth saying? And I would rephrase that. I think the platforms are saying a much simpler question. What speech do I, as a private platform owner, want to have on my platform? Whether it's worth saying or not, do I want it on my platform or do I not want it on my platform? And that's closely related to the question of, what do my users want? Do they want to have an open faucet, fire hose of posts and contents with no constraints at all? Or do they want to have some limitations? Very briefly, in kind of the 40 seconds I have left, on the kind of common carrier issue, we can kind of talk about that metaphor. I actually think there's some much better metaphors. But I mean, at the end of the day, the telephone companies are not saying, I'm giving you phone service, but you can't talk about sexual issues. You can have phone service, but you can't talk about, that's not what phone companies do. They just provide a telephone connection. For these online social medias, up front, in their terms of service, they say, you can come in here, but you have to follow these rules. We don't want pornography or whatever. We don't want hate speech. We don't want a whole set of content. Thankfully, as a First Amendment lawyer, I can tell you there are other places on the internet that if you would like to discuss pornography, or if you would like to participate in a hate speech-based conversation, you can do that. But the platforms that these states are regulating are not common carriers. They have specifically upfront told you what's okay and what's not okay. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, John. So, Bob and I worked in the 1990s on a project by the American Bar Association to try to resolve the question of jurisdiction in cyberspace for online commerce. And for those of you who can recall, in the 1990s, online commerce was just beginning to blossom online. And the problem was most laws, most states said, well, if you have a contract, you have to have a wet ink signature on a document that has 4 corners. And of course, all of the shrink wrap and all of the contracts online had none of that. And the problem was, which is pretty much where we are now again, is how do you solve digital problems with an analog solution, right? How do you solve digital problems with an analog mind? It's very difficult. And I think that's what the problem is, again, that the Supreme Court is being confronted with. And so, Stephanie, I want to give you and Josh an opportunity here to dig a little deeper. You've got cases in Texas and Florida. And obviously, the First Amendment is a sort of stake in the ground for you in terms of where you think these should go. Why don't you get a little deeper into the CCIA's position on these issues and what you've argued?
Time is a flat circle, and there's nothing new under the sun. What we've seen in the last 80 years in this nation as our economy has grown and expanded and blossomed is that it's always the same questions. It's just the facts change. When we're talking about speech being conducted and made by private actors like Michael, like Josh, like any of you, like a website, like an application, we're talking about one of the most sacrosanct rights in this nation, which is the right to speak as you wish, to say what you want to say and not to say what you don't want to say. So truly, the question is simple. The medium might be different, but the fact remains that these are entities that exist for the proliferation of speech. That is their product. That is their calling. That is what they deal in, their own speech, and in this speech offered up to them by third-party members of their communities. Gosh, I'm a telecom nerd from 30 years ago, and I can't say I am surprised, but the common carriage issue is one that we've met for several years and in several different contexts. And it's not as complicated as some would have you believe. And it is a binary question. An entity is either a common carrier or it is speaking, and never the twain shall meet. Common carriage is the carriage of someone else's stuff, their voice, their packages, or they're typing the words that they've typed from point A to point B of the user's choosing without change in form or content. That is what Verizon Wireless does. That is what the electricity company does. That is the life that they've chosen. That is their business. They are not speaking when they carry someone else's speech. ISP, when I was a baby lawyer, stood for Information Service Provider. And the FCC was very clear, an information service provider uses telecom to reach the network to be seen. ISP now means something very different. That has to do with the open internet fight, which I also fight in my spare time, but that's not germane here. Point remains, websites and applications use telecom in order to speak. Verizon Wireless uses telecom to carry other people's speech. They should not be conflated, and once they are separated, as they should be, it becomes very clear. Verizon Wireless has no right to tell anyone how to speak, but the person speaking over those wires, over that spectrum, has every right to speak, whether it's Stephanie or Michael or Bob or Josh or Meta or Google or Twitter and the people who use those services. So perhaps I've been drinking too much CCIA net choice Kool-Aid, but I really don't think that it's a question of analog versus digital. It's a question of private versus governmental intrusion, and it's a question of carrying speech versus being the person speaking and arranging other people's speech.
Well, I think the Kool-Aid comes in a lot of different flavors, Stephanie. Josh, let's move to your points. You've filed an amicus brief on behalf of Missouri, and in fact, you're waving the flag of the First Amendment, sort of turning the arguments on their head. Explain that a little more in depth, and I want to ask you also, how do you feel the justices reacted to those arguments?
Yeah, so I already gave a little bit of a preview about doctrinally why I think this satisfies the First Amendment and what Texas have done, what Florida have done. Just to add a little bit in response to Stephanie's comments and John's comments, I don't think we can so quickly sweep under the rug the history of telegraph and telephone regulations. I mean, John said, well, the phones don't have these rules. They don't do this sort of thing. And then Stephanie said, well, the common carriers, they have chosen not to censor, not to take down content. That's just entirely ahistorical. If you go back to the 1800s, these companies were doing the exact same thing Facebook and Google are doing today. They were censoring content they didn't like. And then the government came in and said, you can't do that anymore. And for 150 years, everybody said, that's okay. That's what the legislatures can do. And so this idea that a common carrier is only, some organization that voluntarily chooses to comply with a must carry requirement, it just is ahistorical. I mean, Verizon does the same thing that Facebook does, which is transport your speech from point A to point B. But to get into sort of a more fundamental point, it's sort of, at a high level, it kind of seems a little strange. Like, how is this supporting the First Amendment? How is a government imposing a regulation? How is that supportive of the First Amendment? And that's, that's a natural instinct to have, to be a little bit skeptical of that, because we're very used to thinking about censorship as a government thing, as something that the government does. And, I'm counsel of record for Missouri in a case in front of the Supreme Court right now where we've alleged that the federal government has done this exact thing, has censored and browbeaten tech companies to take down speech that the federal government disfavors. So I'm very receptive to those arguments. But historically, our entire country is also founded on the principle that the entire reason government exists is to prohibit the private abridgment of our rights. If you look back at the Declaration of Independence, we remember that lofty phrase, that venerable phrase, all men are created equal and we have certain inalienable rights, etc. And we tend to forget the sentence that comes immediately after that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Well, secure against whom? In a society, in a pre-government society, the only parties who can abridge any rights are private actors. And so the Declaration of Independence says, well, we're creating this thing called government because we want to stop private actors from abridging rights. And if you think about the criminal law context, if you think about the tort context, if you think about all these other contexts, it's very obvious. Criminal law is entirely designed to stop private parties from abridging rights. And the argument that we're making here is that the same thing is true with speech. The DC against Heller case expressly recognizes that the right to free speech is a right that predates the Constitution, predates government itself. And so that right can be infringed by private parties just as any other rights can be infringed. And so it is in fact a duty of government to stop that sort of thing. So I'll give you an example. I'll shift from the First Amendment to the Second Amendment. There's a town in Alaska called Whittier, Alaska. It's a nice, quaint, cute town with, I believe it's 2 buildings. There's essentially one single-family residence and a high-rise. Now, let's say that the owner, the management owner of that high-rise says, well, the Second Amendment is all fair and well, but, if you're going to live in our building, which is the only building where you can live, then you're not going to be allowed to own any kind of firearm. Now, I know that would be very, very unpopular in Alaska, but just stick with me for the hypothetical. I think historically that would be understood as private abridgment of rights. And the government could come in and say, you're not allowed to do that. And the same is true in the speech context. And that's why the governments have come in when telegraphs and telephone companies, going all the way back to the 1800s, did the same thing.
JP,
second point, there was a second part to that question, wasn't there? How do the justices, how do justices have reacted to that? I think we might be quite surprised by the results of the net choice cases. I think the justices seemed a little annoyed that net choice had cast a very broad net. They brought what's called a facial challenge, which is, to be quite succinct, a facial challenge means they challenged every single possible application of those statutes. And I think that the justices seem to buy my argument with respect to at least some of the features of Facebook and Google. So I believe it was Justice Barrett who said, now, Gmail certainly looks a lot like a telephone, doesn't it? And so I think there was some skepticism from the justices with respect to net choice's argument, saying that they can attack the entirety of the statute. And, I don't think they necessarily are. I would say I don't think a majority of the courts necessarily has adopted my argument full, hook, line, and sinker with respect to all of the platform's activities. But I think probably a majority has adopted that with respect to at least some of the aspects of those companies.
Thanks, Josh. JP, I think you've got some questions too.
Very large platforms, and the way the cases are presented to the court may or may not have to assume that the laws apply only to entities like Facebook, YouTube, X, and TikTok. In what ways do you think a decision in these cases could be relevant to how states may regulate the broader online space? And somewhat related from an operational standpoint, there's been a lot of discussion about whether the court has sufficient record to evaluate the ways in which the 2 laws would operate, and whether some aspect of the laws as applied might be constitutional and some aspects wouldn't. So what are your thoughts on the second question also?
Okay, let me try to respond to the second one first, and I may punt this to Stephanie if I'm allowed, but I think
Absolutely.
who certainly has more of a background in the background of the cases. But as I understand how these cases were played out procedurally, the state AGs agreed up front that there was a very small number of entities actually covered by the laws, and they agreed to prosecute the cases on that understanding. And so that's a stipulation that's in the record. And normally the Supreme Court takes a case on an as argued basis, meaning, they don't go outside of the party stipulations and find new facts that are inconsistent with those stipulations, but they decide the case on the basis that it was argued. And on the basis it was argued was that the two laws in Florida and Texas apply to a very small group of companies. And frankly, they do, right? One's 100 million users, 100 million in revenue. That's Florida. Texas is, 50 million users in the United States alone. So it's already, a fairly small group of companies. Now, it's not to say that it necessarily covers the universe, but this is not covering everything under the sun. And so just from a procedural standpoint, I think the argument got sidetracked by that. But I think when they go back and look at the stipulations and look at the actual record and what was agreed to and how the cases were actually played out, I think that will be more relevant to them at the time of a decision. As to the rest of the internet, look, if there's a win here for the big companies, then obviously that's going to benefit everybody. And I think the smaller companies are actually the ones that benefit the most from a broad ruling on the First Amendment. It's because the smaller companies are actually the ones that are more apt to create niche communities, smaller communities that are based around specific interests or specific topics, right? You've got review sites like Yelp and TripAdvisor. You've got Reddit, which, although Reddit's a general purpose site, every subreddit on Reddit is dedicated to a very specific topic, right? That's controlled by the users. And so most companies that are in the social media space that are not the size of YouTube and Facebook, they've got to show their customers value, and they've got to engage them and provide them a service that's useful. And they usually do so by differentiating themselves and saying, yeah, you know what, we're not like Facebook. We don't provide every, content on every single topic. We are limited to this specific topic, right? We are focusing here on restaurant reviews. And so our rules naturally say, don't put content that's not restaurant reviews, or don't put fraudulent content reviews. Don't put political stuff in your content in your restaurant reviews. And so I think a lot of the companies that will benefit from them are really not necessarily perhaps in scope. On the flip side, if you allowed these laws to proceed, or if if the Supreme Court said, open season on the internet, I don't know how they would craft a rule that says, how many users do you have to have before you lose your First Amendment right to make editorial decisions? I don't know where that line in the sand would be drawn. And that would be the worry for me, is that, they either have to say broadly, nobody has the right to make editorial decisions online, which I think would be, fly in the face of 50 years of precedent and the Linkey case, or they'd have to come up with something that it is tantamount to saying, okay, these 5 specific companies simply don't have this right simply because they somehow got too big. I don't really see them doing that. That sounds like would be a disaster of a First Amendment opinion.
Thank you. John, you were involved in the 1997 Reno versus ACLU Supreme Court case about the First Amendment's application to the internet. And that case is also central to some of the issues in the second panel. What lessons do you think that case offers for the current Supreme Court cases related to the Texas and Florida legislation?
In that case in 96, 97, what became so clear and what the Supreme Court absolutely endorsed is that in deciding how the First Amendment will apply to a particular communications medium, you have to really actually understand the communications medium and really drill down and dig into it. And the Supreme Court also kind of grappled with, metaphors. They struggled with metaphors to say, well, is the internet, most like, and in '96, the argument was not the telephone. I'll come back to that in a moment. But in '96, the U.S. Department of Justice was arguing that the internet is most like broadcast television. And their theory was, fairly simply, that, gosh, you watch TV on a screen and you access the internet on a screen and stuff comes onto the screen. And so therefore, the government should be able to regulate the internet just like it regulates broadcast television. And the lower court and the Supreme Court said, that's not how the internet works. And so that's actually what my organization is, the Internet Society, founded in the early 90s by the people who actually created the internet, and with a goal of both expanding and getting the internet deployed, but also defending the core concepts of the internet. And so when we engage at the Supreme Court, we actually don't argue about the First Amendment. We actually present to the court, this is how the internet actually works. And this is how the law being challenged would actually play out. And so let me kind of give one example of how this specific law would play out. There is no uncertainty in my mind that Wikipedia, run by the Wikimedia Foundation, Wikipedia absolutely is covered by the Florida law, and I think probably by the Texas law. One could possibly quibble. But Wikipedia is a hub for social content. Every piece of information on Wikipedia comes from users. Wikipedia doesn't create it, users create it. It is a hotbed of moderation, of content moderation. Lots of entries that people post are removed because they in fact are not factually correct. And Wikimedia in fact has more than 100 million regular users globally, which is the standard in Florida. And almost certainly it is covered by the Texas law as well. And Wikimedia could not exist if they had some obligation to not censor based on viewpoint, to not censor or to explain every single editorial decision made within the Wikipedia ecosystem. So that's one of the things that we help try to get the court to understand, that you can't really just take what the states said below, oh, this only applies to the big guys, these big, horrible, evil, big tech companies. No, their law applies much more broadly than that. It certainly applies to a number of Michael's clients. So that's one thing that we did in our brief. But in terms of what the Supreme Court did 25 years ago, in terms of the metaphor, I mean, we need to look at the particular metaphors being used today. I mean, a telephone company delivers a phone call from point A to point B. And Josh suggested that Facebook delivers content from point A from point B. But that's actually not how the internet works. I don't know if anyone here, I'd be surprised if anyone here gets their internet access from Facebook. I get my internet access from Verizon. And Facebook is an endpoint on the internet. Now, it's an awfully big endpoint on the internet, but it is a source of content on the internet. And if I were a Facebook member, which I'm not, if I wanted something from Facebook, I would send a message over my Verizon internet connection to Facebook. And Facebook would send a message back to me, and it would be Verizon that delivers the content to me. And so the kind of telephony metaphor doesn't work on the internet when you're talking about content sites that are not, in fact, the transporting the content.
Thank you, John.
So, Michael, I want to come back to the Supreme Court. One of the things litigators do, and I eventually learned, is you have to give a handle to the court, right? These cases are all very complicated, and judges are always looking for a handle to grab in a case so they can run with it. And so from that perspective, in these cases, tell me what you think is the critical legal issue, and tell me what you think the handle is that the Supreme Court might grab.
Sure. Yeah, I think we've already alluded to this, in the discussion so far. But I think the most critical issue is the right to editorialize. Is that something a large platform enjoys? Is there a First Amendment right to remove content, and is that enjoyed by large platforms? All the cases leading up to today say yes. You have private owners have the right to make decisions about other people's speech. That's what differentiates the government from a private party. And so from that perspective, I don't think that's that difficult a decision to make. We've already seen the preview of that in the Linkey case. And, when I read the oral argument in Moody and Paxton, I see more votes for the side that recognizes that right than I do against it. And I would look to the Chief Justice's comments that, a case called Rumsfeld v. Fair, there's no application here. I would look to Justice Kavanaugh's comments that, what's Orwellian is when the government forces people to remove content and say things, not when a private party tells people not to say stuff. And that his comment that, since Tornillo, we have recognized the idea that, maybe it would be good idea. Maybe it would be a decent idea somewhere to require people to print replies in newspapers when the newspaper criticizes them. But that's not America. We're not going to do that here. We made the decision not to go down that road and not to get the government involved in making editorial decisions that private parties usually make. And I think one of the points, one of the related points they might make on this is, well, look, in the short run, yes, maybe the day you institute this law, maybe some parties, some people, some content doesn't get removed. So yeah, maybe there's a pro-speech effect on day one. But let's play this out a few months, a few years down the road. How are the companies going to respond to this? Well, one of the ways is that they're going to potentially do things that remove places to speak. Some companies are going to say, you know what, this is not for us. We don't want to be in the social media space anymore. We're going to cut off forums for speech. And so now public has fewer places to speak. Then we're going to have companies that say, you know what, we don't want comments on we don't want certain viewpoints on our site. And the only way we can get them down is if we ban the entire topic, right? And so there's an argument there was back and forth all throughout the argument on this. And the Texas Attorney General admitted, if you want to have a content about Al-Qaeda, you want to ban anti-Al Qaeda content. You can't do that. You'd also have to ban the pro Al Qaeda content. So you'd have to remove all content on Al Qaeda. Just think about what this would do in the current controversies over Gaza Strip. You don't want. You say you're a platform, thinks that, hey, certain statements go way too far. Well, now you have to ban any discussion of the war. How is that a pro-free speech result? So I think that's maybe where they go on this and saying, okay, play this out a little further. Long term, this is not going to end up in more speech. Actually, it results in a complete reduction of speech. And that's actually the insight of the Tornillo case, the Miami Herald case, which is, yes, okay, printing Pat Tornillo's reply would end up in more speech in that moment. But guess what? Newspapers will stop criticizing people like Pat Tornillo, and you're going to get a lot less. They're going to avoid controversial topics, and that's really going to lead to a dampening of speech, not an increase of speech. And I think the same analogy applies here. So I think that would be the hook as to to resolve the issue between user rights and platform rights?
Not allowed to answer that question. It won't happen. I know what I want to have happen.
So Stephanie, if CCIA and net choice prevail, what effect do you foresee such a decision having on state legislators that seek to regulate online speech?
Yes, thank you. I think we're already seeing it. I think that our success at the 11th Circuit and our securing of an emergency stay from the Supreme Court as to the Texas statute caused states to pivot, and they're no longer talking about must carry or fairness doctrine for online websites. It's now become parental controls and age verification. And Carl Szabo and his fellow panelists are going to deal with that in about an hour. But I will say that I think states have refined their thinking, and I seem to perceive in these statutes and bills of late that the question whether speech online is expression is settled in their minds, and now they're just focused on children who, it's well established in federal law, have a lesser right in certain ways because they do deserve protection, and it becomes empowering parents. Unfortunately, we're also seeing statutes that, in the aim of protecting children and empowering parents, are nonetheless trampling a lot of First Amendment rights or inviting a lot of bad action that these states aren't foreseeing. Some people talk about the parameters and the restrictions of these various state statutes would basically teach someone how to get around these protections and get to a child more directly than presently is happening. So we definitely are seeing a turning away from the government's wish to completely intrude on private speech and to command and demand private speech, and rather into the child protection realm.
Thank you. I was at a technology-oriented conference last week, and maybe at the end of our panel you could comment on this. There was a reference by one of the speakers that in a year or two, this was from Gartner ultimately, 95% of the content on the internet will be AI generated. And you kind of wonder maybe that has some sort of relationships to some of this discussion, even if only peripherally. So Tom, please.
Yeah, so, I'll tell you, there's two levels of discussion here, Josh, and I want to ask you a question because I'm intrigued by John's points about the practical real-world implications of stuff, because sometimes we tend to get infatuated with lofty principles like freedom of speech and the First Amendment and everything, and we get lost in terms of really wondering what the practical implications of these decisions are. So I want to sort of put our business hats on for a second and talk about some of this stuff and ask you, what do you think? Obviously, there's a lot of market power in some of these companies, both positive and negative. What do you think the market power play is in this analysis, and how does it play out?
Yeah, so I don't think market power is essential to the argument, but it makes the argument a whole lot easier. Here's what I mean by that. I think, common carrier, must carry, whatever label you put on it, it's a very close cousin to what you might call public accommodation. So the fast food joint down the street can't decide that, hey, we don't like Jewish people, we're not going to serve them at our restaurant. You can't do that. We have laws that say you can't do that. Now, from somebody who's arguing about the parade, somebody who's arguing about the newspapers might say, well, this is violating this company's associational rights. They don't have to associate with people that they don't want to associate with. But we have 400 years of common law history saying public accommodation law allows this sort of thing. But there is an intersection with these kinds of laws and the First Amendment. So these must carry regulations are not speech regulations; they're property regulations. They're essentially saying, Facebook, you can't kick somebody off your platform. But everybody recognizes that even property regulations can tingle with speech rights and can interfere with or affect speech rights. And so that's how the First Amendment is coming in here. So what market power does to this sort of thing is it makes it a lot easier to make the argument that, this private company is in fact abridging a private person's rights. When you have, 1,000 different, local fast food joints and one denies somebody service, it's really hard for you to say that, yes, you have, denied somebody their rights. But when we go back to that example I spoke of earlier, Whittier, Alaska, where there's one high-rise building that everybody in the town lives in, it's a lot easier to see how if that company makes a decision, well, there's nowhere else to go to. You literally have to move out of that city if you're upset with that landlord's decision. And you see this going back about 100 years, where the Supreme Court has been much more receptive to these kinds of arguments where the company at issue has substantial market power. There were the Turner cases back in the 1990s that expressly talk about the ability of a cable company to I think the term the court uses, bottleneck the information. So that's one of the arguments we made in our amicus brief. Obviously there's 1,000,001 ways to speak. But there's nothing that quite looks like Facebook does. Justice Thomas, he has this anecdote or this rhetorical flair from a couple of years ago where he says, there's sure, you can cross the river by taking the bridge, and you can cross the river by swimming, but those aren't comparable things. And, same thing here, switching from Facebook to Mastodon or some of the other startups that are trying to get there isn't like switching from Uber to Lyft. It's more like switching from driving to walking. And so that market power analysis really makes my argument quite a bit easier. And frankly, if the court doesn't find market power, it makes it a lot more difficult. That's one of the things that Justice Kavanaugh said when he was then Judge Kavanaugh in the DC Circuit.
So Michael, going back to practical solutions, wouldn't it just be easier if everything had to be viewpoint neutral? I mean, that would make it easier for the companies. It would make it easier all around. How does that play out?
Yeah, if you were already doing little to nothing on content moderation, probably helps your business model. So maybe a certain large platform that doesn't like to do much on content moderation, that's probably a boon to them. Now they can blame the government for tough decisions, but most businesses don't do that. Most internet companies are doing content moderation. They're doing a lot of it. And the reason they're doing it is for business reasons, right? It's because their users want it, right? Their users don't want to have to sift through tons and tons of irrelevant posts. They don't want to see, pornography and violent images when they're at work. They don't want to see stuff that's off topic. They want to find what interests them. They want to find it quickly. People don't have huge attention spans. There's too much information on the internet as it is. And so, websites have to provide some way of getting people what they want. And that is making decisions about content. And so I think for most companies, if you simply say you can't discriminate based on viewpoint, whatever that means, that's going to lead to really just a complete failure to remove almost anything. Anything can be described as a viewpoint pretty much. And they're going to have to go back and figure out, gee, how do we keep users engaged now that they have to sift through all of this spam, all of this unwanted material, all of this obscene stuff? It's not going to be a great user experience. They're going to see traffic go down. They're going to see advertisers flee. It's going to be a tough. It's going to be a tough scenario. So I think maybe for one or two people this is a boon, but for everyone else, this is going to be not something that the business people are going to be very excited about, and I don't think the users are going to like what they see.
John, what are the three most important facts that you think the court should recognize as it considers these cases?
So quickly, we've already discussed the Texas and Florida laws go much farther than the states are claiming, and what Michael just said. users want moderation. And if you don't have it, it's not going to go well. But the third point is really the kind of undercurrent of domination, of market power that is kind of swirling around the state's arguments here is really false. Facebook used to be the top platform, and it is dwindling as people our age start kicking the bucket. Facebook's users are going to keep going down. Twitter used to be the most dominant short form speech platform on the planet, and it's gone way down, and a lot of people have left it because the moderation practices have changed. But I actually want to kind of come back to the kind of very core notion, which is not consistent with our facts, that somehow I, as a speaker, I have a right somehow to go onto any public platform I want and to say my piece, whether or not the platform wants me there. And we have the rhetoric of, the town square. The Facebooks and the Twitters are the new town square. The town square never allowed every citizen of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts colony, to crowd into the Boston Common and to have their word. In fact, our town squares historically were distributed town squares. And sometimes they had smaller groups, and sometimes they were even self-selected groups where people who supported one side of a political faction would have a discussion here, and people who supported another side would have a discussion elsewhere. There wasn't some big historic plebiscite where every voter got together and voted. And that's what the internet is. The internet is a lot of private, self-selected platforms for speech. Some people want to engage on Facebook, and Facebook lets them in. Some people have a different preference. They want to engage on Truth Social. It doesn't mean that, and Truth Social, by the way, was set up to be no moderation. But guess what? They learn that they have to moderate. Without moderation, they're a useless platform. So they moderate, and they in fact moderate on viewpoint. You can't go talk about pro-abortion policies on that platform, and that's fine. I support Truth Social's right to do that, but that's what we have. We haven't given up a town. The town square, because we never had a ability for all citizens to talk into a single platform, which seems to be what the states want. They want to require every major platform to allow every speaker to speak, no matter how factually incorrect or repetitive or sometimes violently threatening they are.
Thank you, John. Stephanie, the court raised Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act during an oral argument as being a complication or impediment to resolving Paxton and Moody. What are your thoughts on the interplay of Section 230 and the challenge to the Texas and Florida laws?
In the Supreme Court, we don't need it. We don't need to talk about it. The Supreme Court questions presented regard whether online speech is protected speech, and that claim has not been litigated in either case. But our attorney, Paul Clement, was asked this question: what is the interplay? Is 230 inimical or in some way contrary to the First Amendment? And actually, again, it is a very simple answer. These two instruments of law are in perfect harmony. First Amendment says private speakers get to speak. They get to say what they like and not say what they don't want to say. Section 230 is these interactive computer services, which is what the best term Congress could conjure for them in December of 1995, are carrying other people's speech. And we want them to be able to do that free from government intrusion and free from heckler's veto. So Congress decided for these interactive computer services, when you're hosting other people's speech, we want you to curate and choose and organize and display content in the way you like, and we don't want you sued over it, because that is the surest way to end the internet before it began. So taken together, these two instruments of law, one in the Constitution, one in the federal code, both indicate this nation's commitment to private speech and to protecting private speech from governmental intrusion, whether that be a judge in a district court or a state legislature.
Thank you. And Josh, can social media companies claim a First Amendment right to remove third-party content, in your view?
Yeah, I think the answer is it kind of depends based on all of what I said earlier about market power, et cetera. But I think to hop into what Stephanie just said about Section 230, I don't think the text supports that argument. Section 230F. Stephanie talked at a high level about sort of these aspirations of the goal, et cetera, of Section 230. But the actual text says you are not responsible. If you're a platform, you are not responsible for anything unless you helped develop it in whole or in part. Now, what the tech companies are saying is they're saying, look at all this, look at the way we present speech. The way we present speech is our own speech. We have our own First Amendment right to do this. We can delete stuff. We can, corral stuff. We can arrange stuff. And once we do that, that becomes our speech. That's what they have to do to make their First Amendment argument. But as soon as they do that, now they are responsible for in whole or in part developing speech. They have just said that this is their speech, which is completely contrary to what they have said in every Section 230 case. And what that does is that opens them up to a lot of cases. There's a Second Circuit case a couple of years ago, Judge Katzmann was on it, where essentially the argument was, well, Facebook's algorithms have helped promote terrorist content, et cetera. Facebook said, no, Section 230, that's not our speech. And now they're up in the Supreme Court in the net choice cases saying, actually, it is our speech. We have a First Amendment right there. And I think they're going to have to pick one or the other. They're not going to be able to have it both ways for much longer.
Thank you. We're going to have several more questions, then open it up to all of you for questions. And then each of our wonderful panelists will have some closing remarks. So Tom, please.
So John, let's assume that the Supreme Court upholds the Texas and Florida laws. Give us a view of how that changes the internet and speech on the internet.
In my view, I'll go back to how Stephanie started this entire conversation, saying the internet would become unusable. Speech on the internet would become a frustrating, not very rewarding exercise. If I want to go talk about gardening on gardening.com, and I only want to talk about gardening, but gardening.com is not permitted to keep non-gardening talk off of gardening.com, I'm not going to go to gardening.com anymore. I'm not sure where I'll go. I'll go to my local gardening club. State might say, oh, no, we're only targeting the big guys. But the First Amendment principles that are going to apply here, that whatever the Supreme Court announces, are not going to be easily discernible at, oh, it is constitutional for a gardening.com to keep hate speech off, but it is not constitutional if gardening.com gets really successful and really big. Then they can't keep that off. And if that's the line they draw, if they try to draw some constitutional size line, that itself will have a hugely negative effect on the internet, because that would ultimately entrench the current large players. And Michael's clients, the kind of medium and small tech companies, frankly, wouldn't be able to, don't have the resources to comply with these Florida and Texas laws in general. But their goal is to become big, to compete with some of the large players. And if there become a magic line that the Supreme Court says, if gardening.com gets big, it can't moderate. So, the Internet Society really submitted our brief to kind of say, if you can't have moderation, you really can't have useful citizen engagement. And that's what the Internet created. That's what in the 1997 Reno case, the Supreme Court recognized, that this is an unprecedented new medium that works differently than anything we have ever had before. And it allows a dialogue across our country, around our world, in ways that we've never had before. And that's a very positive thing in our view. But if moderation is out the door, that kind of dialogue is really going to wither.
So, Michael, let's assume that the Supreme Court rules in favor of the platforms. What does that mean in terms of what the government can regulate in the future? And to give our audience here and our online audience a preview of the next panel, who protects children online, and where does that all go?
Yeah, well, I would first start by just noting that these laws are very unusual. We just don't see that many content-based laws generally, and not ones that are so specifically aimed at changing altering the marketplace of ideas. I think the government just has to go back to doing what they normally do, which is you regulate conduct. You don't regulate content. And they have much more leeway when they regulate conduct, because if it affects speech, it's subject to intermediate scrutiny. And, you have a chance of that law surviving First Amendment scrutiny. The decision here is not going to forbid all government regulation. I think we all accept that these platforms are already subject to many, many regulations, including regulations about marketing, about privacy, data security. I mean, there's many, many things that can be regulated, that are being regulated. And this law, I think a decision for the platforms is merely going to reiterate that, look, you can't. The state overreaches when it reaches into the realm of content. So let's get the state out of content, and let's get them back to regulating things they normally regulate. As to the kids, regulation about kids, I think that's going to be a tricky one. I think it's all going to depend on how much content of adults is going to be impacted by regulation on kids. And if you go back to the Reno versus ACLU case, then, the court says, look, it's sure, we like the fact that you try to do something to protect kids here, but you can't do it in a way that forecloses a huge amount of speech that is made by adults. And so I think that's going to be, I don't think this case necessarily decides that, but that will be the challenge for that case, and also for all the other related regulations on age-appropriate design and social media addiction, things like that.
I have two quick questions which aren't we haven't discussed, and then if anyone maybe could comment on these, or if you can't, that's fine too. And one is much more specific. So during COVID, Dr. Bhattacharya was promoting that we should have a more healthy debate, or more of a debate, on whether or not the Swedish approach was the right approach without having lockdowns. And he wasn't able to, for the most part, get his ideas out on many of the social media platforms, and in fact was almost ruined at Stanford. And so either in his case, when there's a major public policy, with a major public policy debate, or a more generalized one, how might these laws impact that type of discussion? And I actually think that it's somewhat of a societal good to be able to have debates on some of these. And then the second one was that AI one, whether if indeed 95% of the content at some point is going to be AI generated, how that might relate to many of the points you've raised.
I'll be happy to take the first one. And I think that dovetails or glides nicely into a point that Josh raised, which is the Murthy case, the jawboning case. The jawboning cases, as they presently stand, I'm pleased to report, indicate that tribunals are aware, and indeed the state of Missouri is aware, that these websites and applications are speakers in themselves, and they were victims of what happened as much as the journalist or the medical professionals whose viewpoints were taken down via government coercion. And I think that somewhat, puts Missouri at odds with itself as to whether they believe that CCIA's members engage in expression. I think that going forward, these Florida and Texas statutes teach us the wrong way to do it. And I think by striking down such ham-fisted and wrong-headed regulation, what will happen is we will only underscore the rights of these private actors to speak. We will foment and support the marketplace of ideas. We will protect the internet, which is, as Josh aptly said today, is as close to an infinite resource as humankind has ever created. And only through protection from government intrusion can we truly ensure that discussion and debate and different ideas are brought into the marketplace. So CCIA is hopeful that the precedent that we set in these two cases is only going to further protect us from the kind of takedown situations that we lived through during COVID and that caused so much confusion.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comment on that question or on the AI content generation? Oh, yes.
Sure. I'd be happy to jump into the AI question, but mainly to kind of honestly question whether that's really, right. Will 80, 90% of the content on the internet be AI generated? Maybe, no idea. But I'm confident that when, hundreds of millions of grandparents want to interact with hundreds of millions of grandchildren, that will not be AI generated. There will be a lot of person-to-person communication. And I'm also confident that when folks want to get together on gardening.com and discuss, which trees work best here or there, that will be a challenge for gardening.com or for Facebook, if it's still around in this hypothetical world, to exert moderating capability, the ability to try to, frankly, prevent non-human conversation if that platform chooses to prevent non-human conversation. And so that, it will be a technological challenge that, I certainly don't want the state of Florida, the state of Texas, hamstringing the ability of online forums to try hard to keep the conversations human to human.
Thank you.
I'll chime in real quick on the Murthy case. We absolutely think that the platforms are harmed when the federal government or the state government comes in and jawbones or browbeats. Now, we don't necessarily think that's because the platforms are exercising their own First Amendment rights, but anybody who is coerced into doing anything by the federal government is necessarily harmed. One thing I found very interesting about the intersection of Murthy and net choice, though, I mean, we've heard a lot about how a lot of the panelists think that these laws are bad, they're going to create a bad internet, et cetera. One thing in favor of the Texas and Florida laws is that they would prevent what the federal government has done in Murthy, right? If Facebook must comply with Texas law and they must not take down content based on, political viewpoint, et cetera, well, then when the federal government comes in and tries to pressure them to do so, they can't do that anymore. One thing I heard, I worked in the Senate for 3 years. I've met with Mark Zuckerberg. I've, met with a bunch of these tech companies. And one thing I repeatedly heard from these tech companies, who, especially those who wanted to enter China, is they wanted regulations against the companies here. Because when China wanted to force them or make them do something, they really wanted to be able to stand on American law and be able to say, sorry, I can't do this thing, China, that you're asking me to do. The same thing would happen in this context when the federal government is trying to pressure Facebook to take down Dr. Bhattacharya's speech. Facebook wouldn't be able to do so because of the Texas law.
Thank you. Michael, any comments on either of these? No, thanks. So, Tom, perhaps you can ask a last question, and we can have questions from the audience.
Why don't we go right to the audience and see if we've got any questions before we wrap this up? And I really think this has been a terrific panel. We could probably do this all day. But are there any questions in the audience?
Thank you, Bob. Yes.
Turn the mic on.
That do it?
Yes.
Josh, you filed on behalf of about 20 states generally viewed as red states. New York filed on behalf of about 23 states that were generally viewed as blue states. And they emphasized police power, and they apparently did not take a position either in favor or against the laws, but just basically asked that the Supreme Court scrupulously avoid an interpretation of First Amendment that effectively immunizes platforms from meaningful regulation. So, what was your guys' reaction to that? Do you think that was helpful at all? And do you think that may get some traction with the Supreme Court? And also, Stephanie, if you have any thoughts on that, those amicus briefs, that would be great.
So we included in our amicus brief sort of a shout out to the New York one saying, hey, we agree with a lot of what's in the New York brief. And I don't think that should surprise anybody. Essentially what the New York brief said is, look, these platforms have a lot of harms that they can impose on society. We have a governmental interest in regulating to mitigate those harms, which is exactly the position that Missouri and 19 other states took with respect to the censorship issue. So we dialed specifically in on the censorship issue, but generally agree with the larger analysis that there are lots of things that these platforms are doing that could abridge people's rights, that could harm people. And there is, we can hammer out specifics later or at some other points, but there is a regulatory interest in this sort of thing. I mean, we can talk about the mental health crisis that young girls especially have been going through since 2013. We can talk about all kinds of other things. Instagram a couple of years ago, a lot of documents came out showing that Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, was very, very aware of the effect that their product was having on young girls. And there's certainly a role to be played regulatory wise in that area. I expect the age verification panel will have a lot more to say about that.
Beginning with the Missouri group, let's call them, I think their position goes to the core of expressive speech and wanting to force people to say things. The irony here is that with societal issues like self-harm that we have heard about, that Josh spoke about, what Texas and Florida laws would do is help self-harm content get out there, because let's be clear, Texas and Florida do not want private speakers to engage in editorial choice. They would be forced to put self-harm content on the internet. That is the scary part. In terms of the New York group, let's call them, their position, frankly, to Stephanie Joyce wasn't a surprise. All they were saying is to the court, exercise some restraint and don't make a statement which frankly I don't think would have been likely anyway, but don't make a statement so broad as to indicate that no tribunal and no legislative body has any right to regulate not the content of the expression, but items like privacy of data and cybersecurity. And that message is something that CCIA fully supports. CCIA has supported federal baseline privacy legislation since 2000, and I know that because I was there. So I do see the two groups slightly differently, and I think at this point it's apt to say that the public accommodation argument is a conduct argument, and it's about status, and it's about the purported punishing of people about status, but really what's happening on the internet is about speech and not people's status. It's not kicking people out of the bookstore. It's simply ensuring that what they say does not violate community standards. And there's actually a study out there about whether these websites and applications get associated with unsavory content. There are a lot of people that say, well, that's Mary Smith's post, Facebook. No one associates that with you, so you have no right to be upset about it and no right to try to remove it. That's patently untrue. There's a paper out last October from Melissa Patulis that shows that people do in fact attribute hate speech and unsavory comments with the website and application that is displaying it, and that only further underscores why actually there's expressive content that's at stake here.
We got time for one more question. Go ahead.
Hey, I really like the panel. My name is Eric Osterweiler. I'm on faculty in the CS department here at Mason. And obviously I'm not a lawyer. So, this one, I don't know how this will land with folks, but, I'm sort of steeped with a lot of the technical details. And so when we're talking about Facebook or Instagram, we're talking about different platforms that do things slightly differently. These are sort of like broadcast channels to varying degrees. Sometimes I have my own space, and sometimes that's when comments come and get reflected around. So my question, which I hope is not a bad question for the panel, is there a difference between when I post something that someone would maybe want to take down, and it's just simply not reflected out to people, which is one of the functions that a lot of these social networking platforms do. They promote things. You search, it bobbles up. It shows up in your feed even though you didn't ask for it. Versus if you were to come directly to my space, you can see what I said, but it's not propagated around because somebody had a moderation view of it anymore. In other words, I still get to say my piece, but you don't all have to hear it because someone deemed it as a moderation target.
I think I'll chime in there. I think that aspect of the application is precisely what Justice Barrett was cluing in on at the oral argument, that there are some parts of Gmail, Facebook, Instagram, what have you, that look a lot more like peer-to-peer telephone type communications. Maybe that's emails. Maybe that's, you can think of your Facebook page as like your own different blog or whatever, and people can go to it and see it. And so that aspect of Facebook looks the most like a telephone service. These sort of direct message services, the blog posting, feature of Facebook. And as you said, it's when we get into the broadcast area that it starts to become quite a bit murkier. I still think it looks more like a telephone than a newspaper at that point, but it's a harder argument for me to carry once we get into those aspects of Facebook and Google and other companies.
So I'd kind of respond to Eric's question by saying, frankly, at the end of the day, the two different possibilities of, okay, this is kind of dicey speech, but we're not going to take it down, but we're not going to promote it, or this is speech that will get promoted. That's an editorial decision. That's an editorial judgment, and the First Amendment protects editorial decisions. And unlike Josh's characterization earlier, Section 230 doesn't make. If I'm a platform and I make an editorial decision about whether to promote your content or just let it be displayed on your own homepage, that's not my adopting your content. It's still your content. I'm still not liable for your content under the statutory framework we have, but that's still an editorial decision that is protected by the First Amendment. Just as if the Washington Post decides to print your letter to the editor or not print your letter to the editor.
Terrific. Thanks a lot. Many, many, many years ago, I was a philosophy major, and this reminds me of one afternoon studying French existentialists. It really forces you to think. It really forces you to get down into the issues and understand both sides and how to try to resolve all of this. So I really appreciate the contribution of all the panelists, Stephanie, John, Josh, and Michael. Thank you very much. This is terrific, and we will watch with great interest how the Supreme Court decides this stuff and where you guys go next.
Thank you, Tom. And if everyone could, y'all are tremendous and an amazing discussion. Please make a brief closing comment for everyone. So, Stephanie, would you like to please go first?
You can't buy phone service from Twitter. Common carriage is different from speech, and market power is irrelevant. Attribution is real on the internet, and Section 230 is necessary to ensure that we have a functioning internet that we all enjoy today. And let's remember that the most important thing that any polity, any group of people can do is protect themselves from government intrusion. And that's what CCIA and NetChoice have endeavored to do in the Paxton and Moody cases.
Thank you, Stephanie. John?
I agree with everything Stephanie said. I would only add that, at least when I was in law school, and I went to a pretty good law school that Josh went to also, but a little bit before him, the First Amendment is primarily a bulwark against government regulation or censorship or suppression of speech. Right. And so to me, the First Amendment is not a tool that can be used to force private speakers to carry speech that they don't want.
Thank you, Michael. Josh?
And John just outed both of us as not having ever had any real formal legal education.
Oh, yes. Totally agree. We both went to a school that did not, in fact, teach us to be lawyers.
I've tried to learn a lot in my practice since then. The thing I would leave with is the idea that content moderation does not have to be an on-off switch. I mean, we've heard from some of the other panelists, like, if you do this, there's not going to be any content moderation. And I'll talk about the Texas law just real quick. Texas law doesn't sweep nearly that broadly. I mean, even when you think about telephones, there are obviously must-carry requirements for telephones, but telephones are also allowed to filter out spam messages, for example. Taco Bell is required to serve people of all races, of all religions, but if you don't have a shirt or if you don't have shoes, they can kick you out. And same thing with the Texas law. You don't have to have a situation where it's an on-off switch, content moderation or no content moderation. There's a whole lot in between.
Thank you, Michael.
And I'll just leave everyone with the content moderation, editorializing, whatever you want to call it, is a pro-speech activity ultimately. And the reason it's pro-speech is that it makes useful forums for speech. The whole point of all these forums, Facebook, Reddit, TripAdvisor, Yelp, whatever, is for people to post speech. We've all been talking as if the platforms are sitting there trying to reduce as much speech as possible, when it's actually the reverse. They're trying to engage people in the way they think will most likely get them to post relevant speech that other people will want to read. And every website is going to do it differently. Some of them aren't going to do it well. Some of them will. And it's an experiment. But at the end of the day, what they are trying to do is provide a useful forum for people to speak. And laws that inhibit the ability to do that are going to reduce speech in the long run.
Thank you, Michael, and Josh, and Stephanie, and John. You all are tremendous and an amazing discussion, so thank you. We'll take about a 5-minute break and then reconvene with our next panel, also going to be interesting discussion on parental consent and age verification.